And I also, before I begin my remarks, I want to welcome formally our new members, Senator Johnson, Senator Tillis, Senator Blackburn. We said hello when you came for the organizational meeting. It's your first hearing, and I think a very appropriate one. The committee meets today to discuss Danny Werfel's nomination for IRS Commissioner. We want to welcome him back to the Finance Committee. We know him well. I expect that a significant portion of the hearing will focus on IRS funding that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's where I'll begin. And colleagues, I'm going to focus on 3 points. First, for some time, I've talked about the two tax systems that exist in America. One's for firefighters and nurses and teachers, and their taxes come straight out of every paycheck. And then there's another tax system for the billionaires and the high flyers, who to a great extent can pay what they want when they want to. So today we're going to focus on ending the two-tiered system of enforcing America's tax laws. That's what's needed. It's a big part of what Democrats sought to address in the Inflation Reduction Act, because audit rates today are far higher for those of modest means than the very wealthy. Second point, the Inflation Reduction Act makes sure that the IRS gets the resources to go after tax cheating by the big guys, the ultra wealthy, the multinational corporations. Now, there are members who oppose that effort. And I get that they want to deflect and distract. That's why people have heard about these fantasies about 87,000 agents armed with rifles busting down people's doors. If you don't want to engage on the real issue, which is tax cheating by the ultra-wealthy multinational corporations, you change the channel. You try to talk about something else. Third, contrary to a lot of baseless attacks you hear today, improving technology and staffing up customer service is a big win for law-abiding families and small businesses. In my view, they're going to be less likely to face an audit thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to briefly touch on each of these 3 points. Working people and the middle class today have a 99% rate of compliance with the tax code. Yet working families who claim the Earned Income Tax Credit get audited far more than do the wealthy folks. Didn't get that way by accident. A decade of Republican budget cuts gutted the IRS's ability to do the kind of in-depth enforcement work that's needed to make sure that the multinational corporations and the very wealthy pay what they owe. From 2012 to 2020, our economy got a whole lot bigger. Yet the total dollar amount of unreported taxes uncovered by corporate audits fell by nearly 60%. Over the last decade, audit rates of wealthy taxpayers making more than $5 million a year fell by 90%. On the other hand, the audit rate for working people didn't budge, even though the IRS was working with fewer resources. That means working Americans bore a much heavier burden. That's where my second point comes in. When Democrats wrote the Inflation Reduction Act, we decided it was long past time to say to the multinational corporations and the tax cheats at the top, nobody is above the law, and that includes you. That's why the bill included new resources for enforcement. Democrats have made clear that the funding is not going to go to auditing Americans who earn less than $400,000. In fact, during the debate on the legislation, Republicans actually struck legislative language from the bill that would have constructed even stronger guardrails on this issue. For Democrats, this is about going after cheating at the top and doing a better job of collecting what the very wealthy and the big corporations already owe. The official tax gap says that $540 billion in taxes goes unpaid each year. We asked the IRS Commissioner, Charles Rettig, about this because we thought it was higher. He said it could be as high as $1 trillion. So the Inflation Reduction Act funding is going to help us get at that issue. Finally, better technology and better customer service personnel is going to allow us to go a long way to relieving headaches for typical taxpayers and small businesses. More customer service personnel is going to make a big difference because in the past it's been a struggle to get anybody on the phone when you call the IRS with a question. In the spring of 2021, to show some progress, 11% of the phone calls got through, pretty darn low. Last year it was 13%. In the early stages of this filing season, colleagues, it's up to 90%, a huge improvement. These tech upgrades and more personnel ought to reduce the odds that a law-abiding family or a small business faces an audit. These days, taxpayer information goes into a lot of outdated systems that struggle to communicate with each other. Fixing that is going to help the IRS better use the information it already has. If the IRS can answer its own questions and resolve issues proactively, it's less likely that a busy parent, or let's say, colleagues, the owner of a small local restaurant opens the mailbox one day to find a scary letter from the tax man. With that, we want to thank Mr. Werfel for his willingness to return to public service in the IRS. We had a good conversation when he came by. I believe the President made an excellent choice with his nomination. There's a lot of history of working with the Finance Committee, and it's been positive. I know the late Senator Hatch was very fond of Mr. Werfel, and we look forward to our discussion. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Werfel, thank you for your willingness to serve and to answer our questions today. The IRS exists solely to serve taxpayers and fairly administer tax law. The Internal Revenue Code requires the IRS Commissioner and all IRS employees to act in accord with codified taxpayer rights, including the right to be informed, the right to quality service, the right to challenge the position of the IRS and be heard, the right to privacy, and the right to confidentiality. Over the last several years, Americans have time and again seen the IRS fail to meet these obligations, and they are rightly concerned about the vitality of their taxpayer rights. Statute requires the IRS Commissioner to ensure the IRS respects these rights, and the next Commissioner needs to show that he will faithfully stand up for the American taxpayer. The next IRS Commissioner must also demonstrate that he can be fair, consistent, and impartial as an umpire for taxpayers rather than reflexively pro-IRS. While I did not always agree with former Commissioner Rettig, he was consistent and called the balls and strikes the same for everyone. Recently, the IRS simply overlooked statutory deadlines for implementing new laws, including third-party network reporting and EV tax credits. These delays seemed conspicuous given that other recent and complex tax changes, including the amortization of R&D expenses, corporate book minimum tax, and stock buyback excise taxes, all took effect without necessary guidance. The need for an objective, consistent, and level-headed IRS Commissioner who is laser-focused on taxpayer rights is even more imperative given the staggering $80 billion in additional funding that the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act just gave the agency. For reference, $80 billion is more than 6.5 times the IRS's typical annual budget. These additional funds come despite the fact that over the past 2 decades, Congress has appropriated the IRS hundreds of billions of dollars in annual funding and tens of billions of dollars in more supplemental funding with little improvement to show for it. The IRS continues to utilize outdated methods and processes that even the taxpayer advocate called crazy. A recent report by the Treasury Inspector General for the Tax Administration shows that these antiquated processes cost hundreds of times more than an updated approach that would better serve taxpayers and the IRS. This is just one example of how funding has become a scapegoat for mismanagement. It is no surprise to hardworking Americans that the IRS currently ranks dead last in a recent Gallup poll rating federal agencies. Sending the IRS on an unchecked spending binge has no intrinsic value. Unless there are outsized results to match the gargantuan investment, the IRS's supplemental billions will simply become another example of government waste. Because the funding lacks any accountability measures or guardrails, the next IRS commissioner shoulders the primary responsibility for outcomes, as well as planning, tracking spending, and transparently monitoring outcomes. Americans and their elected representatives are watching. Will the IRS be honest and fully and deeply transparent? Will the IRS use best practices, rely on unbiased data, and set common sense goals? Given how the funding was conceived, designed, and adopted, I'm skeptical. But I will look to you, Mr. Werfel, to fill the gap if you are confirmed. The fact that nearly 60% of the funding will go toward hiring enforcement personnel, more than 14 times the funding set aside for serving taxpayers, is a particular concern. Unease about supersized IRS enforcement hiring has nothing to do with supporting evasion by wealthy tax cheats, but comes from a fear that the IRS will waste untold taxpayer dollars chasing speculative or marginal revenue recoveries, while hardworking Americans and small businesses end up in a dragnet. When I offered my amendment to statutorily protect taxpayers making less than $400,000 from increased audits on all of my Republican colleagues stepped up and voted yes. No one on the other side voted yes. And now we have a statement from the Secretary of the Treasury that, in fact, we won't see this 60+% of the $80 billion spent on auditing those making less than $400,000. My colleague, the chairman, has indicated that that is the intent of this money, but it is not what the law says because my amendment was not allowed to be adopted. Unenforceable edicts are so easily broken. In sum, the new IRS commissioner will shoulder immense responsibility. If confirmed, Mr. Werfel, you must be the change agent we have long been promised. Thank you, and I look forward to your testimony and your detailed response to our questions.
I thank my colleague. We're going to get going. The important point is Democrats have made it very clear that we have an ironclad commitment to protect people who are making under $400,000, and regrettably, the Republican approach would have been to give a free pass to billionaires, for example, who have figured out a way, as we've noted, to pay little or no taxes for years on end because they go to their accountants and they say, make sure I'm not getting any income. So we're going to talk through those issues. Right now, Senator Carper is going to introduce our guest.
Yeah. Before I do that, Mr. Chairman, thanks so much for giving me this opportunity. Let me just follow up on your comments. I've been a member of this committee for about 15 years, for as long as I can remember. We've had IRS commissioners, Democrat, Republican, come before us and say, plead for the resources they need, human, technology, and so forth, to be able to do their job. Every new Congress, the head of GIO comes and he says to us, here's a high-risk list of ways that we're wasting money, and one of the ways that we're wasting money is not collecting the money, the taxes that are owed. A high-risk list every year says, for God's sake, fund the IRS, and we've done that. Today, the question is, what kind of leadership are we going to provide for the IRS? And leadership is the most important element in the ingredients of any organization that I've ever been a part of. And I want to, again, thank our chairman and our ranking member for the privilege of introducing Danny Werfel. It's confirmation hearing to serve as the next IRS commissioner. History repeats itself today. Some 13 years ago, I had the privilege to offer similar remarks before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which, when I introduced Danny as the nominee for controller at the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. At that hearing, Danny was joined by his wife, Beth, by their daughter Molly and their son Sean, who were just young kids at the time. I see they're not young kids anymore. Today, Molly and Sean both join us as college students, with Molly following in her mother's footsteps by studying psychology, and Sean following in his dad's footsteps by studying public finance. Also in attendance again are Danny's parents, Barbara and Fred. Nice to see both of you, and I'm happy to see all of you again, and I want to thank you for sharing your husband, your father, and your son with the people of this country. I especially want to thank Beth for sharing your husband with all of us. I'd be hard-pressed to think of anyone more qualified than Danny Werfel to lead the IRS during this critical time of rebuilding. Throughout his distinguished career in public service under both Democratic and Republican administration, we have seen Danny work tirelessly to make sure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely. He's been a lifelong champion for good government and has become known as the expert that people turn to for help in navigating the many challenges we face in government and in this country of ours. That's why both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama chose Danny Werfel to lead their Chief Financial Officers Council. That's a group of CFOs, Chief Financial Officers, for the largest federal agencies who work to improve financial management in our federal government. That's why President Obama chose Danny to serve as OMB controller, where he oversaw federal spending and tirelessly worked to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in our government. And that's why in 2013, President Obama appointed Danny to be the acting IRS commissioner. A job Danny performed well, so that he earned bipartisan praise from both Senate Finance Committee Chair Max Baucus and a ranking member at the time, Orrin Hatch, for his many contributions and performance. The American people deserve an IRS that meets their expectations. That includes getting their phone calls answered, their problems solved online, and their refunds delivered in a timely way. And after decades of underfunding, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, this agency finally has the necessary resources to make significant improvements in the service that we provide to everyday taxpayers. We need a leader at the IRS who's been confirmed by the U.S. Senate, a Senate-confirmed commissioner who's critical to achieving the policy objectives of the Inflation Reduction Act, including providing best-in-class customer service to the American taxpayers, delivering on historic clean energy tax credits to meet our climate objectives, and ensuring that the wealthy individuals and corporations in our country pay their fair of taxes too. In closing, Danny Werfel has proved time and again that he has the management expertise and experience, the background necessary to tackle this very difficult and challenging mission head on and to succeed. In fact, he's done this job before, so he can hit the ground running on day one. In closing, I want to urge our colleagues to confirm Danny and do so soon, very soon. And once again, I thank our chair and ranking member for the privilege, really, of introducing him to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Mr. Werfel, you are lucky to have Senator Carper in your corner. Normally what we do is we go to your opening statement, but would you like to introduce your family? I understand they're here.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, my statement goes through and introduces them. So I'll start that, and then we'll introduce the family as part of my statement, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman.
That'll be fine. Why don't you go to your opening statement?
Mr. Chairman, can I just say one? I'm chairing in the hearing in the Environment Public Works Committee at the same time that this is going on. I'm leaving, but I'll be back. Okay. Thanks so much.
Let the record know. Okay.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, I am honored and humbled to come before you today as President Biden's nominee for Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. I want to thank Senator Carper for his generous introduction, and I want to express my gratitude to the committee for considering my nomination. I also want to thank President Biden and his administration for placing their confidence in me. I'm grateful to have my family with me today, this morning, supporting me today as they have through every step of my life, my wife Beth, my children Sean and Molly, and my parents Fred and Barbara. From a young age, I saw the honor in serving others. I saw that honor in my grandfather, a World War II veteran and postal worker, and my mother, a social worker who helped place people with disabilities into gainful employment. I see that honor in my amazing wife, who has spent more than 25 years working as a psychologist in the public school system. Their examples inspired me to pursue a career in public service. I felt a great sense of pride when I showed up at the Office of Management and Budget for my first day of work as a GS-9 in the late 1990s. And even more pride 13 years later when I last sat in a Senate confirmation hearing as the nominee to the OMB controller. While at OMB, I served under 9 different directors of both political parties. This experience reinforced the importance of having a true north for how to best serve the American people. At OMB, I learned that the essential foundation of government is public trust. Public trust requires transparency, collaboration with oversight entities such as Congress, adherence to the rule of law, responsible stewardship for taxpayer dollars, equity, and fairness. In 2013, with these lessons now a part of my professional DNA, I was selected to serve as acting commissioner of the IRS. While serving, I witnessed the dedication and talent of the IRS civil servants. Since leaving the IRS, I watched from afar how these employees provided economic lifelines to hundreds of millions of families and small businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic. Their true north is their deep belief that the American people need an IRS that provides all taxpayers with world-class customer service and implements the tax code in a way that is just, fair, and equitable. I share in this belief. As an IRS alum, but more importantly as a taxpayer, I have been concerned about gaps in capacity that have impeded the IRS's ability to meet its critical mission. The result is that hardworking, honest taxpayers who need assistance in meeting their tax obligations are not getting the services they need. The IRS has also been ill-equipped to unpack complex and intricate returns of high-income taxpayers. Following the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, Americans rightly expect a more modern and high-performing IRS. Last year, Secretary Yellen issued a directive that the IRS will not increase audit rates for small businesses and households making under $400,000, which I am committed to meeting. Therefore, if I am fortunate enough to be confirmed, the audit and compliance priorities will be focused on enhancing IRS's capabilities to ensure that America's highest earners comply with applicable tax laws. Also front and center will be efforts to modernize and dramatically improve taxpayer service. If confirmed, I will lead these efforts in close collaboration with this committee and will be unyielding in following my true north to increase public trust. While unheralded, effective implementation of our tax system is necessary to fund critical government services. For 8 months in 2013, I had the privilege to walk into the IRS and draw inspiration from the workforce and the solemn duty of this mission. As I reflect on the public service legacy of my family, I think about the example I will set for my children by rededicating myself to a career in public service. To be given this opportunity again would be the greatest honor of my life. Thank you for considering my nomination. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Werfel. Before we begin, there's some obligatory questions that we have to pose to you. First, is there anything that you're aware of in your background that might present a conflict of interest with the duties of the office to which you've been nominated?
No.
Second, do you know of any reason, personal or otherwise, that would in any way prevent you from fully and honorably discharging the responsibilities of the office to which you've been nominated?
No.
Third, do you agree without reservation to respond to any reasonable summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Congress if you're confirmed?
Yes.
Finally, do you commit to provide a prompt response in writing to any questions addressed to you by any senator of the committee?
Yes.
All right, I'll start with questions and we'll go with Senator Crapo. The first is I want to address this fact that the wealthy get audited far less than do working families. And we've obtained information that low-income taxpayers who claim the Earned Income Tax Credit are over 8 times more likely to be audited than large partnerships. If confirmed, what would you do specifically to make sure the IRS ends what I call this 2-tiered enforcement system and starts auditing partnerships, for example, favored by billionaires at a higher rate than low-income taxpayers who claim the Earned Income Tax Credit?
Senator, I start, and I thank you for the question, and I think it's a very important one. I start with thinking through what are the ingredients of effective tax implementation, and certainly equity is one of them. And to achieve equity, I think we should be able to look at the audit footprint and see balance. I don't think, based on what I know now, that there is balance today. I'm not at the IRS, but if there is a imbalance, that is concerning, especially if there's a disparate impact on poor people. If poor people are more likely to be audited than wealthy, that is something that I think potentially degrades public trust and needs to be addressed within the tax system. Secretary Yellen, I head into this job with a directive from Secretary Yellen, and that is to balance this audit footprint. And I'm excited and eager to work with the IRS on a strategy that I'll make very transparent on how to do that.
All right. There have been troubling recent reports that Black Americans are at least 3 times as likely to be audited as other taxpayers, even though the IRS doesn't collect information on race. This raises serious questions about discrimination with respect to audit selection. This is something the IRS has to address. If you're confirmed, what will you do to uncover the reasons for the racial disparity in audit selection, and what will you do to correct it?
I agree, Senator. This is very concerning. I go back to the point in the first question. Fairness is an essential element of tax administration, and we have to have an understanding of whether our approaches or activities are having disparate impacts on any population. It's particularly alarming if it's having a disparate impact on racial minorities. Right now, not being at the IRS, I don't yet have a good sense of what the issue is.
Let's do this. Will you commit within 60 days of being confirmed that you will get back to us and give us the underlying reasons, in your view, why there is this discrimination and what you'll do to correct it within 60 days?
I will absolutely, as soon as I get to the IRS, talk to those individuals that are working this issue and report back to you on what we're finding.
60 days.
Understood, Senator.
All right. With respect to the tax gap, which is attributable to the wealthy, the Treasury Department estimated last year that the tax gap was about $600 billion, with the top 1% accounting for the largest share. But the IRS's latest tax gap projections don't even show how much high-income taxpayers cheat. They completely omit non-compliance from multinational corporations, flow-through entities, foreign activity, and digital assets. Commissioner Rettig said when the committee asked if the tax gap could be as high as $1 trillion if you included those areas I mentioned that have been omitted. If you're confirmed, what will you do to ensure that the IRS measures the tax gap in these areas and you actually have a strategy for reducing it?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. When I think about the objective to improve the capacity the IRS has to unpack complex and intricate returns, I think we have to do a number of things. I'm not sure that training the current workforce will be sufficient. I think we want to hire and bring in experts, maybe some of the same individuals that earlier in their careers prepared these very intricate returns and are ready to come back and potentially serve their country and maybe years later help us unpack them. And when they're doing that, I think, Mr. Chairman, will be able to not only unpack and help collect more revenue from high-income taxpayers and large corporations, but also understand how to better measure that so that going forward, the tax gap assessment has a more clear picture of what this gap is.
I'm going to wrap up this way. I know Senator Crapo's got a hectic morning. I know a lot of my colleagues do. I'd like you to tell us what you're going to do, if confirmed, to reduce the audits of family-owned small businesses who follow the rules. And you heard me in my opening statement say, you know, it seems to me with better technology and highly trained staff, you're going to be in a position to focus on these big players, these multinational corporations, the ultra wealthy, who you haven't been able to focus on in the past because those have been more expensive, cases. And this can redound to the advantage of small businesses who are complying with the law and complying with the rules. So tell us as I wrap up my time, because this is something that we all feel strongly about, and you've seen the back and forth with respect to the small businesses. What specifically are you willing to do to reduce the audits of family-owned small businesses that follow the rules?
Yeah, I think, first of all, with the directive from Secretary Yellen to focus IRA resources on high-income taxpayers, certainly there'll be a rebalancing of the audit footprint. I want to take a look with the IRS team at other audits and figure out if there's a way to determine where, essentially we'd be wasting our time to go and audit because there's such a high percentage and a high probability that the balance due is already being paid. And by that, we can go after more issues where there might be something underlying that's nefarious, something that relates to advertent cheating or evasion. I think there's opportunities, and I will come back to you, Mr. Chairman, with a more specific set of plans on how to rebalance the audit footprint in a way that's fair, equitable, and as transparent as the law will allow me to be.
Okay, thank you. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question, Mr. Werfel, is on this plan that Senator Wyden has been talking to you about getting some details on. There's growing uncertainty about when, or even if, the IRS plan for spending the $80 billion will be publicly released. I understand that you have not been involved in that because you are not the IRS commissioner yet, but you probably will be if your nomination proceeds as it looks like it will. It's a widely shared view that the IRS must release this plan in real time and allow stakeholders to provide feedback. If you are confirmed as the IRS commissioner, would you agree that the plan to spend the $80 billion will be publicly released and that you will allow public feedback from stakeholders and others on it?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I agree that the plan that is put together should allow both you, this committee, and the public to connect the dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act to the various activities and investments. I really want to earn this committee's trust. I think as a former budgeteer, I will earn your trust by putting together a very clear plan that articulates where the money is going. And as a former OMB controller, I hope to earn your trust in terms of making sure that those funds are spent wisely. So I think you and I are sharing the same value, Senator. Let's be public about the plans, and let's make sure that we're building trust in the way forward.
Well, thank you, and I'll take that as a commitment that you will publicly release the plan. As you know, and as has already been discussed here at the hearing, I'm very concerned about the use of the funds for the enforcement part of the plan. We have never had an argument in this committee about whether we need to give the IRS the necessary resources to bring itself technologically into the 21st century and to get the adequate response to the taxpayers that they now don't get, so that the IRS can even answer the telephone, so to speak, when taxpayers are trying to communicate with them. The battle has been over this completely uncontrolled and undefined commitment of 60% of the $80 billion to enforcement. And there's been a lot of talk about, well, we only want to enforce this against those who are rich, super rich tax cheats. But yet when I brought that amendment I referenced earlier, no one would support it and put that right into the law. So I want to get into that. From the IRS's own data, the two largest single components of the tax gap, that's the difference between taxes owed and paid, are small businesses, small business income, and individual non-business income. In response to my questions, the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation told us that these shortfalls are overwhelming. They are upwards of 90%. And upwards to 90% of these shortfalls fall on hardworking Americans with modest incomes, far under $400,000. Now, Secretary Yellen reportedly has said she's directed the IRS not to use this somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion to enforce against people with incomes less than $400,000. My colleague, the chair, has said that is not to be done. What I want to know is, how strong will you make that commitment? The language we've gotten from the secretary was in this term of, well, we want to get balance. I don't want to know balance. I want to know whether you are going to commit today that the plan will not allow this supersized enforcement money to be utilized against people who make less than $400,000 per year. Will you make that commitment?
Senator, yes, and I made that commitment in my official statement for the record. I am committed to Secretary Yellen's directive on how the audit should move forward under the Inflation Reduction Act, and look forward to working with you and you holding me accountable for that.
Well, thank you. Secretary Yellen's statement leaves a lot of wiggle room. I want to be sure you know that I don't expect to see wiggle room in this commitment. Last question. There's been a lot of debate in the last Congress that was stopped finally, but some of us are concerned that it's not over, about whether the IRS should have the authority to get into people's bank accounts if they make over $600 a year or spend over $600 a year. And then some said, well, we'll make that $10,000 a year as the target point, or $10,000 a year spending or depositing. There's a lot of concern about the intent at the IRS to move forward with some plan. We've stopped it here legislatively in the battles in Congress last year. I want to know whether there are any intentions at the IRS or any intention on your part to regulatorily seek to expand the ability of the IRS to literally invade and look into the bank accounts of Americans simply because they have deposited more than $600 or $10,000 or whatever number into their account.
Senator, I'll go back to my background. I'm a rule follower, and I would only take actions that are consistent with what the IRS authorities are under the law. But I'll also say this. I think about effective tax administration as requiring a bunch of different factors, reducing paperwork burden on the public, but also avoiding unnecessary intrusion. So if we're going to take a step, I'm going to want to make sure this committee is comfortable that A, we've taken that step consistent with what our parameters are in the law, and B, that we've made the right balancing decision that this is the right step to do in the interest of the taxpayer and balances the importance of not invoking unnecessary intrusion. And my commitment is to hold to these factors and work with you collaboratively to make sure we balance them effectively.
Well, I would hope that you wouldn't seek any plan like I just described, which I think is a violation of the privacy of our American citizens, unless Congress directed it.
I'll just say to my colleague, I think I'm about as big a privacy hawk as there is around here. I'm certainly going to make sure people's privacy is protected as well. Okay, our next two senators will be Senator Cardin and Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, first of all, thank you. Thank you for your willingness to serve our country in this critically important position. There's an easier way to make a living, so thank you for being willing to take on this challenge. I also want to acknowledge that I believe your strongest assets in the IRS are your workforce. I know many of the individuals who have really are very talented. They've gone through struggles with lack of resources, and I just urge you to invest in good people, continue to invest in good people, and do everything we can to increase the morale within the workforce. The work that they're doing is critically important to our country. I agree with you on your commitment to be a rule follower. We're the ones who pass the laws. Then they're interpreted. And yes, there is confusion in the way that people comply with our tax code. And historically, we've had a high compliance because it's been voluntary compliance. Everyone believes they're being treated fairly under our system, but that's no longer the case. And yes, when you look at following the rules, if you're a higher income taxpayer or a more complicated taxpayer, you have a lot of professional help for you to interpret the rules as most favorably as they can to your advantage. And when you don't have audits, you don't have an aggressive way to have a uniform interpretation of those rules, you run into the tax gaps that we have today. And so I agree with my colleagues that we want everyone to comply with the rules. It's not an income limit here on complying with the rules. We know that those of the higher incomes have found ways to bend those rules, and that has to end. And that's one of the reasons why in passing the Inflation Reduction Act, the resources were made available so we can close that gap and have a better confidence among the American taxpayers that they're being treated fairly. I just want to underscore that point. I know I had a chance to talk to you about that, and I'm convinced you understand that. Everyone needs to comply with the rules, but we have to make sure that everyone understands the rules through the audit process. So I just encourage you to do that. I want to raise an issue that's been raised by several of my colleagues, and that's small businesses. I chair the Small Business Committee. It's one of the major areas of concern that are raised by small businesses around this country, the challenges within our tax system. I think we in Congress have to take responsibility for that because we're the ones who developed the rules. But we need your help in how we can develop the rules and apply the rules to help small business owners who don't have the same capacity to deal with the tax code that larger companies have. So I'd just like to know your vision on how we can work together to make the tax code more understandable and fair for small businesses, which are the growth engines of our economy.
Absolutely, Senator Cardin. And, it was interesting in Senator Crapo's opening remarks, he made reference to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And I got some very good advice prepping for this process to go and print out and read the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And I've made it a habit now of reading them every day, and if confirmed, I will read them every day. And one of the ones that jumps out at me is the right to understand and have clarity on what is expected of them. And I think there's more that the IRS can be doing to reach out, especially to taxpayers that don't have the means to hire accountants or law firms to navigate the tax system. It's a very complicated code. It can be daunting. And so I think there has to be an objective to meet taxpayers where they are. If they can't afford the resources to help them navigate, how can the IRS do more to answer their questions? Whether it's people in taxpayer assistance centers, whether it's better solutions online, whether it's working with intermediaries, tax preparer associations, local chambers of commerce, whatever it is, to hold sessions that might be helpful. I'm ready to roll up sleeves and do what we can to help working families, small businesses meet their tax obligations in a much easier way than it has been to date.
And I would point out the Taxpayer First Act and the Bill of Rights are all been areas that we've weighed in on to do exactly that, to be a consumer-friendly agency. Phones have to be answered, advice has to be given that's accurate so people can respond in a timely way. And your response to my first question gives me great confidence that we can work together to achieve those objectives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Grassley.
Congratulations on your appointment, and I'm sure your family and everybody that knows you is proud of the responsibilities you assume. I'm going to follow up on the very first question that Senator Crapo asked you. It's about spending the $80 billion, and it deals with a bill that Senator Thune and I introduced, the IRS Funding Accountability Act, and you said that you would make public the report that you're going to put out when you get done with it. So this bill emphasizes doing that annually so we can compare one year with the previous year. So if confirmed, would you direct IRS to update the spending plan annually for Congress to review regardless of whether this bill passes or not?
Senator, thank you for the question. And I've worked a long time in government and seen a lot of the initiatives that you've undertaken to increase transparency and increase the integrity of the federal process. It's so essential that we build trust. And I think by sharing whatever we can share within the law with the public about our go-forward plan is going to help build the trust. I will work with this committee to figure out what the best manner in which to make this public and the frequency of it. And so anyway, I'm very much looking forward to working with you on that.
I want to go to ProPublica release that they put out, and it's clear that IRS needs to do a better job safeguarding taxpayer information. General Government Accountability Office and Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration reports identify many vulnerabilities in the IRS information system, particularly as it relates to the use of cloud systems. Just last month, GAO released another report on IRS's implementation of cloud computing that made an additional 9 recommendations. So, if confirmed, will you work to protect taxpayers' information by addressing the serious vulnerabilities identified by TIGA and GAO?
Senator, I'm glad you asked that question. When I sat down to think through what are the most important factors of effective tax implementation, the very first thing I wrote down was data security and making sure that we protect taxpayer information from unauthorized disclosures. And then your point about the Taxpayer Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office, these are incredibly important voices that frequently provide recommendations to organizations like the IRS. I'll absolutely take all of those recommendations seriously. I always have. We'll work with them to make sure that we're implementing those recommendations in a way that advances more data security so taxpayers can build confidence that we're holding their data sacred.
According to National Taxpayer Advocate 2021, that agency saw IRS telephone assistance reach an all-time low with only minimal improvement 2022. Moreover, IRS still has nearly 2 million unprocessed paper tax returns from last filing season. Addressing poor taxpayer service needs to be a high priority for you. However, if the nearly $80 billion in additional funding IRS has received, only $3 billion is dedicated to taxpayer service. Prior to supersizing enforcement, IRS should focus on using the $3 million for improved customer service. If confirmed, will you prioritize deploying $3 billion more than that before expanding audits and other enforcement?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I think if anything's going to keep me up at night, if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed, it's going to be what are the right efforts we can undertake to increase taxpayer service. Phone calls should be answered, questions should be resolved. And I think what's really important is that the IRS Commissioner implement the law that's been passed to the maximum impact that serves taxpayers' interests. So if there's $3 billion in increased funding for taxpayer service, and that's what Congress in its wisdom enacted, we will make sure, and I will work to make sure that those $3 billion are spent wisely and with maximum impact in improving the taxpayer experience.
And my last question deals with a bill I got passed in 2005, the IRS whistleblower program. So far, it's an underutilized IRS enforcement tool. By encouraging those with knowledge of tax fraud to step forward, it helps IRS direct its limited resources and since 2006, this legislation's brought in $6.4 billion that would have otherwise been uncollected. In recent years, awards to whistleblowers have fallen while processing times have increased. The average time for processing whistleblower claims is now 11 years, and I think that's unacceptable. If confirmed, what steps would you take to ensure well-functioning whistleblower programs so we can bring in a lot more than $6.4 billion?
Senator, I appreciate the question, and as I mentioned earlier, I know this is an issue that you've spent your career working towards. I think there are certain levers that are in place at government organizations, and I'll speak to the IRS specifically, that help make sure that it is following the right set of rules and procedures and conducting itself in a way that builds trust. I think the Inspector General, I think GAO, and I think effective whistleblower methods or effective whistleblower functions are critical to that. I want to learn from the IRS. You mentioned some statistics that are concerning about the potential functionality of that process. I will look into it and figure out what corrective actions may be necessary to strengthen it.
Senator Grassley, time's up, but I just want, for the record, for people to know how important this work is that you're talking about. And you and I have been working on these whistleblower issues for a long time together, and that will continue here. Thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Werfel, thank you for your willingness to serve and your family's willingness to let you serve. Very much appreciated. 2 weeks ago, the IRS notified taxpayers in Colorado in the middle of filing season that they could face a tax on their tax refund, which in my state we call TABOR refunds, Taxpayer Bill of Rights refunds. Coloradans receive TABOR refunds when the state collects more in taxes than we allow in state law. It's a tax refund, not income. And in 30 years, the IRS has never taxed these refunds for the vast majority of Coloradans, and Congress hasn't passed any laws to change that. So the IRS's announcement threw our entire filing season into chaos, and it would have hit my state with about $400 million in additional taxes at a time when working families are already struggling with rising prices in this economy. And that's why I called the Treasury Department and the IRS and demanded that they fix this. And over the weekend, the IRS clarified that it won't tax last year's TABOR refunds. But I should never have had to make that case. And people in Colorado should not have had to make that case, especially when they're in the middle of filing their taxes. Mr. Werfel, I know you weren't involved in this, otherwise I would have called you. But I want to put the issue on your list because I am intensely interested in making sure we don't repeat this again next year. So my question for you is, first, will you commit to working with my office and the state of Colorado ahead of the next filing season so we aren't inflicting needless chaos and confusion on my state?
Yes, I will, Senator. Absolutely. I think it goes back to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, clarity on what is expected. I think, clearly it's better to have that clarity in advance of the filing season with reasonable notice.
Even if you thought it was a good idea, which for the record, I don't think it's a good idea, and 30 years of experience with the IRS tells us it's not a good idea. But even if you did, the last time you should do it is when people are already filing. In fact, the guidance that we got incredibly from the IRS was don't file your tax returns until we sort this out. And again, I share Ben Cardin's view that there are many hardworking public servants there, but that's an example of the kind of self-inflicted wound that I think is just, well, it doesn't, it makes people believe there's just a fundamental nonsense of government. So I look forward to working with that. Mr. Werfel, as you know, I've been in the Senate now for more than a decade, and the most significant issue that I've worked on is the expansion of the child tax credit in 2021, along with my colleagues on this committee, Chair Wyden and Senator Brown. That one policy cut childhood poverty in half in America. It cut family hunger by a quarter in this country, the country that has the highest childhood poverty rate in the industrialized world, notwithstanding the fact that we are the wealthiest country. It benefited, the child tax rate, it benefited over 90% of the kids in my state and all across the United States. At the time, many people doubted that the IRS could deliver the CTC on a monthly basis. But to its credit, it did. It wasn't perfect, but about 90% of eligible children received the payments. My biggest disappointment is obviously that Congress let the expanded CTC expire, and I still believe that we will eventually pass the expanded CTC. I'm glad there are members of the Republican caucus that have their own proposals. If you become commissioner, you will play a vital role in making this a success. What lessons did you learn from the rollout of the expanded CTC and the American Rescue Plan that we could carry forward, and what steps would you take to make sure that we deliver the CTC to every eligible family?
Senator, I understand how hard you've worked on this issue, and it's such an important one. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, I wasn't at the IRS, but I admired from my status as a civilian and a citizen the way in which during a pandemic the IRS was able to implement both the child tax credit and several rounds of economic impact payments. I think the lesson I take from that is it can be done, and I'm hopeful that if there is a law that comes out that requires that solution to be redeployed, the fact that it's been done once will enable it to be done again. But again, I would love to get to the IRS if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed and see learn more about what that process took, and how repeatable it is, and then position the IRS even more effectively through the right investments in technology, process improvement, and as a necessary human capacity, so that when these things come up, we can hit them out of the park.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I realize that. Had I a moment to ask another question, it would be about how to get more families signed up on EITC, so I'll send that for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for making sure we get that information. The next two, unless Senator Thune comes, will be Senator Warner and Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, great to see you again. And again, as when we had a chance to meet individually, appreciate your willingness to take on what's got to be one of the more thankless tasks in the government, but obviously something that's extraordinarily important. I may differ with some of my Republican friends on this because, frankly, I think the reinvestment in the IRS is extraordinarily important. I want to touch on a couple of issues. I know people have already raised concerns about, just plain responding to constituents on call-in numbers. We did not a very good job during COVID. We picked up a little bit recently. We've got the corresponding challenge around tax returns that still have not been finished. How are you going to balance that, even with the infusion of additional capital, into that customer service component of responding to inquiries, but at the same time making sure you don't get further backlog as we approach the tax season?
Yes, Senator, I appreciate the question. I think often, from my experience in my brief tenure at the IRS, you are juggling a lot of different priorities. The way I think about your question is really to understand better what the portfolio of what's incoming. Certain things that are incoming may be able to be handled quicker, maybe be able to handle it in an automated way. I think one of the big opportunities that exists is putting more technology into the customer service solution, whether that's tech solutions in the call center, whether that's improved digital solutions on the web or on applications on smartphones. Understanding and mapping, essentially, and this is something that I think I learned in the private sector and over the last 9 years, understanding how the best private sector entities in the world manage their incoming and prioritize it in a way that's more efficient. I'd love to benchmark that and then see if the IRS can beat those benchmarks. And we have, I think, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to put in some of these solutions that will benefit all taxpayers.
So we want to look at how you're going to be able to balance those two and get it right. I want to raise one of the things that I hope even critics of the IRA would acknowledge, that one of the areas that we desperately need to make more investment in is tech modernization.
Yes.
It feels like every time we try to upgrade the IT systems at the IRS, it's been failed efforts. The close to $5 billion that have been allocated is terribly important. My friend Senator Tillis and I are co-chairs of the Cybersecurity Caucus, and one of the things that is, and I see this a lot from my position as chair at Intel, we get better at cybersecurity, but the bad guys get better at an equal rate, and too often cybersecurity ends up being bolted on to legacy systems rather than built in from the inception. And my hope with this kind of close to $5 billion capitalization, we can really think about potentially getting rid of some of the legacy systems and almost starting over. Talk about that, and talk about how, again, you're going to make sure that cyber protections, because we're talking about the most critical personal and financial information of Americans and businesses, is going to be built into that strategy.
Yeah, Senator, earlier I made the comment that when I sat down to think about what are the most important elements of tax administration that I could think of, data security was the first thing I wrote down. It'll be one of the first questions I ask if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed. What is our baseline right now in terms of our cyber resiliency and our cyber performance? Where are the risks? What are the, as we update the technology backbone, what changes do we need to make? Now, as you say, not so that it's bolted on and therefore potentially less robust, but deep in the roots of the system itself, from A to Z, we feel extremely confident that there is no material cyber risks that we face. I don't have a good feel for right now what the risk profile is, but it is a top priority to understand it because it's mission critical.
Well, I know Senator Tillerson, I would want to follow up on that. And again, I hope, again, we think about IT not from simply adding on to legacy, but in some cases, building on. I'm going to follow Senator Bennett and not ask for a response on this, but I would love, Senator Cardin's already raised the challenges of small businesses. I think some of the problem has been lack of coordination, for example, between the SBA and the IRS. So this coordination of IRS with other federal agencies, I think will lead to a better customer experience and a better overall experience. And again, I hope you'll be able to get back to me with that. Thank you for my extra 17 seconds.
Thank you, Senator Warner. And Mr. Werfel, you should know a number of the members of this committee are also on the Intelligence Committee chaired by Senator Warner. So you're going to find an intersection there around cybersecurity and other issues. Next in line is Senator Langford.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Werfel, good to see you again. We got to meet each other when you first dove into the IRS, deep into the pool, right after the Lois Lerner hole experience that happened, where the IRS was using the power of the IRS to be able to slow down or silence conservative voices on that. Obviously, there was a transition in leadership at that time, and you walked into the middle of all that to be able to clean that up. So you're walking into another set of challenges as well. Obviously, the IRS has a record amount of dollars that are being thrown at it at a very rapid time period. We're waiting to get a plan that not only we can see on how it's going to be done, but the American people can also see how that money is going to be spent. There were some very specific statements that were made early on how that money would be spent. They wouldn't affect anyone with $400,000 or less, but that actually wasn't put in the statute to require that. And so there'll be a lot of questions of how that money will actually be spent, what that looks like. ProPublica, a year and a half ago, released taxpayer returns, put them out publicly, which by the way is a violation of federal law to print someone's tax returns, but that apparently no one's been prosecuted for printing it and releasing it, and no one's been prosecuted for actually leaking it, and we haven't been able to get information on how it actually got leaked. So that's out there. And then there's also, you've got a record number of people eligible for retirement. So you thought you were in the fire last time you walked in IRS. You've got a lot that's on your plate this time. Let me ask you a couple quick questions. The 1099 that Ranking Member Crapo has already brought up as well. This particular one is interesting to me. Part of the American Rescue Plan and part of rescuing America, apparently by my Democratic colleagues, was getting information about my Venmo transactions with my daughter to the IRS. So my daughter does still, she's a great lady. Occasionally she'll run to the store and we'll buy something and we'll bring it home, and I will tell her, will you grab that at the store and I will Venmo you to pay for that. I am quite confident that will exceed $600 over the course of a year of random things like that with our family. Those records are now going to go to the IRS because of the American Rescue Plan. Part of rescuing America is getting that. The IRS was supposed to start collecting those last year and requiring third-party organizations to do it. They delayed it out and said now it'll be this year. What's your best guess on how the IRS is going to have to manage what is actually taxable in that and what is just tracking the information of me paying my daughter back for groceries in her household?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm familiar with the issue in terms of how it's been reported publicly. I think when I reflect on these issues that emerge during the filing season and the IRS then pulls back and says, we have to study this, I would imagine it's because they're getting a lot of feedback that whatever is going on right now is unsustainable. So we need to take a moment and reset. As I mentioned earlier, one of my objectives would be to prevent that from ever happening so that we're prepared going into each filing season and we mitigate the risk of that happening. But you raise a really important question about how does the IRS balance all these factors? Is it the right approach to be asking for information? I go back to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights.
Right.
Paperwork burden, intrusion.
Great, thank
What
you.
is the right balance? And I'll start with the law. What does the law expect us to do? And then to the extent there's discretion in the law to make sure that we're taking all the right reasonable steps, I want to move there. And then I want to be transparent with the committee. This is what we think. This is the tensions that we're seeing, and we want that feedback. And if it comes to be that we see that there's opportunities for certain personal transactions to not be included, let's talk about doing that as well. So I'm open to a lot of different options. The bottom line is, as always, what will build trust with the taxpayers?
Well, I think a lot of taxpayers are going to be shocked that part of the American Rescue Plan was over the course of a year, if you do $600 in Venmo transactions, you're not going to have to report that to the IRS. I think that's going to be pretty shocking to a lot of folks in the days ahead, and there'll be a lot of technicalities and issues. This customer service issues also come up. I've seen some recent press releases and quite frankly, some crowing from the IRS about our customer service percentage numbers are so much better of answered calls and such. And so I actually went and pulled the facts on the percentage calls on it, and I have to tell you, I was a little surprised on it because the way the percentage works on it is last year there were 9.2 million people that attempted a call and only 3.7 million actually got an answer. So then the crowing was about the percentage is so much better this year. There were 5.6 million attempts to call and 3.5 million calls. We actually answered fewer calls last year than the year before. We just had fewer people try to call. So the announcement was about, gosh, we're doing so much better, the percentage is better. It's just because people didn't call anymore. We're actually returning fewer calls. So this issue, we're gonna have a lot of dialogue about how to improve customer service and what that's gonna look like. You don't have time to be able to go into all the details now, but just know we're gonna have a lot of dialogue about this in the days ahead. So,
Yes, sir.
thank you, Mr. Werfel.
Thank you.
Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations. Thanks for coming to visit with me and having a chance to talk about a number of the things, including the things that Senator Langford was just talking about. So, this is a critically important position in the government. Very few agencies in Washington are as present in the lives of working families as the IRS, for better or for worse. Many people feel like it's for worse. And that's what I hear in Wyoming. They're afraid of the IRS. They're people that are honest people, want to pay their taxes, want to pay what is owed, don't want to have someone come after them if they think they've done right, if they think they've called and they have called and couldn't get an answer, finally get an answer, may have been told something after waiting hours and hours, try to comply. And we talked about this. Restoring the credibility of the agency, I think, is going to be a steep mountain to climb, and it's something that when we visited about, I said, this is critical as part of your job. The policies that have been enacted by President Biden's reckless tax and spending bill really were not going to be helpful in trying to regain the credibility of the American people for the agency. The American people have seen examples of political targeting at the IRS, a weaponization of the tax code. People feel we have an administration that is woke and weaponized against them. We know about the poor customer service, less than 10% of the taxpayer calls getting answered. In the private sector, the level of performance would put someone out of business. But in the federal government, you get more money. The answer is pay more money, increase the spending. Massive backlogs have left desperate families and small businesses waiting on much-needed returns as they fight skyrocketing inflation. Some of these returns that I hear we get calls in around the state of Wyoming, people waiting for over a year for returns of their money. The IRS has been plagued by leaks, highly confidential taxpayer information to news outlets like the one that Senator Langford just referred to. These are just a number of examples. I think from our discussion, you know that there is plenty of cleaning up to do. And the focus needs to be on improving customer service for hardworking taxpayers. Regrettably, that wasn't the mandate of this ill-conceived tax and spending package. $80 billion in additional funds for the IRS. And as I read it, only $3 billion went to improve taxpayer services. More than $45 billion went to support an army of IRS agents. We saw the ads of what people are looking for in terms of ability to carry weapons. This is a shakedown small business operators and middle-class families to pay for expensive partisan policies. And it just gets very, very bothersome. And read this new report that the IRS has proposed a revenue producing procedure this week to crack down on the service industry's reporting of tips. Now, people are going to have until May to provide feedback. So we're looking at 87,000 new IRS agents. The promise was that not going to come after anybody that makes less than $400,000, but what's just come out with is a new program aimed at how to better report tips. So we're not doing what the chairman had said, so well, this is going after millionaires and billionaires. This is going after waiters and waitresses. That's how I read this. So, I mean, this is the big difference in terms of what I hear from the chairman of the committee and what I see happening and hearing from people in Wyoming. So let's see. Ranking Member Crapo has introduced legislation to protect taxpayers making less than $400,000 from increased audits. The department has said it. You are on record today saying you would not increase audits on Americans making less than $400,000. So would you be supportive of legislation codifying your promise, just adding additional guardrails for taxpayers?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I will share with you that I believe the role of the IRS commissioner is not to opine on whether to support a piece of legislation, only to tell you whether we think at the IRS it's administratable or not. And so my partnership with this committee will not be oriented around what the tax code looks like, more like how do we get the tools we need to, whatever you and your wisdom in this committee and their wisdom enact, how do we implement it effectively?
Well, when we visited and I mentioned the difference of how much money is spent for others, and you said, well, in the wisdom of Congress, I said, well, it wasn't really the wisdom of all of Congress. It was a bill that was passed on party line vote with not a single Republican in the House or Senate voting for it, to do the sort of service type things that you and I agree need to be done for the American people and American taxpayers. Is the $3 billion enough? Is this a appropriation in terms of how the money is divided, in terms of what you might need if you came to us and said, to really hit the taxpayers' needs so people can answer the phones and give people correct information? Yeah, has the money been allocated in a way that you would have done it if you could say, let me divide the money differently?
Yeah, I want to be able to come back to you, Senator. As I said earlier, we've been given a mandate by Congress with several billions of dollars to improve taxpayer service. My commitment is to make sure that that money is spent wisely, that we get the most out of that money so that it benefits taxpayers, all taxpayers. And I will commit my time to making sure that there's transparency, as I've mentioned, into what we can and can't do with the funds that are provided.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, thank you for spending time with me yesterday and your willingness to take on this task. I think based on the discussion today, you have a pretty good sense of what you're getting yourself into. From my standpoint, I think the job of the IRS should be pretty straightforward. It's to administer the tax law and collect the revenue the government requires. Unfortunately, Congress, in creating this tax law, has created this complex mess, which is almost impossible to comply with. I mean, you've seen the studies where you have 10 different tax CPAs that complete a return. None of them get the same answer. That's a very sad reality. I want to focus my question, though, on what I think is going to be a part of the public debate here is going to be that tax gap. Because as commissioner, it will be up to you to really determine how you're going to employ the resources to try and close that tax gap. And again, we all want to see people comply with the tax code. We don't want to see people be tax cheats. But I'm hearing all kinds of different things. I mean, I get a report here that Joint Committee on Taxation said that 78 to 90% of that tax gap really is with taxpayers under $200,000, lost reported revenue. The chairman's talking about it's all with the top 1%, although the top 1% pay more than 40% of the income tax. So I want to get your sense of where is that tax gap really occurring? I mean, what types of taxpayers? How much is due to just complexity of the tax code?
Yeah, well, Senator, I appreciate the question. I think that I start with, you can start with some basic facts, and I think about the fact that most Americans, working families, pay their taxes through their payroll. And then therefore the IRS has 99% of the information it needs to assess a balance due. And then just based on research and studies and what's been publicly reported, the very intricate, complex returns or filings from high-income taxpayers, that's very different. That is not paid through the payroll. There's a whole host of different issues that come up, and I've seen estimates that say as much as 20% of that income is opaque and shielded from IRS view.
So let me just quick interrupt.
Please.
There's always a big deal made of these big companies that pay nothing. Big companies oftentimes have IRS agents in their offices, right? Correct?
I'm not sure I follow, Senator.
Well, I mean, large companies have, massive tax departments. Oftentimes, IRS agents are basically embedded to make sure that they comply. The big companies that pay zero are just complying with a very complex tax code, correct? And you generally have IRS agents there making sure that they're complying as best they can with the complex tax code, correct?
Senator, I'm not sure. Just because I'm not as familiar with what I understand right now, and I need to learn more if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed, is that IRS agents or revenue agents, they don't feel they have the capacity or the understanding to unpack the complexity of some of these activities.
If up to 90% of the tax gap is in with misreported income of people making less than $200,000, I mean, are we just going to misspend all kinds of money trying to go after the wrong group of people? Particularly if we're saying, we're not going to touch anybody making under $400,000. I mean, how much of the tax gap is with illegal activity, things like drug trafficking? Again, I'm trying to get a sense of where you really do think the dollars are, and if the dollars aren't. Again, there certainly are dollars at the top, but if there's not enough, I mean, we're going to spend more money trying to get money out of, the taxpayers that don't represent the huge amount of the tax gap.
Senator, I think I always start with this guiding principle: how do we build trust? So to answer your question, I would say for high-income taxpayers, I think we can build trust across all taxpayers by saying we're going to do a better job understanding their balance due than we do today. Because if you're an honest, hardworking American who's doing your taxes effectively, you should expect large corporations and high-income taxpayers to do the same. For the rest of the tax gap that you're describing, my going-in hypothesis is the way to build trust is to understand what are the highest priority areas to go after. Are there unscrupulous tax preparers that we need to assess? Are there individuals or organizations that are looking to evade taxes, and is there a way we can focus on that versus others that are honest taxpayers? So I don't know yet because I'm not there, but the commitment here is to better unpack the tax gap for you and for the American people so there's clarity on exactly how this all shapes up on a go-forward basis.
Okay, we need to look at the actual data and go based on the reality situation rather than just rhetoric.
I agree. Evidence-based is critical.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Blackburn is next. Her first question.
Thank you.
Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, indeed it is. Mr. Werfel, welcome. We're delighted you're here. And I'm so pleased your country music-loving wife is with you today. Being a Tennessean, we discussed this yesterday and have to get you to Nashville. I want to go back to the question that Senator Barrasso was asking you about on the service industry tax compliance. And I've heard a lot about this in Tennessee. People in the service industry, hairdressers, wait staff, delivery personnel, gig economy workers, and they are incensed by this. Many of them are women, and they're sole providers for their family. And you have said to Chairman Wyden and to Senator Crapo that you're not going after people under $400,000. So let me ask you this and put it to you this way. How many waiters, waitresses, hairdressers, barbers, gig economy workers do you know that are making more than $400,000 a year, and why would they be targeted by this administration?
Senator, thank you for the question. I think if the IRS is successful going forward...
How many do you know?
Well, if the IRS is successful going forward, then the individuals and the occupations that you mentioned will see only impacts in service improvements, in particular with the Inflation Reduction Act funds, versus an increase in any audit rates. That's the goal.
This is the contradiction.
Please.
You can say you're not going to go after anybody that is making less than $400,000. I don't know anyone in this category that would be affected by the service industry tip compliance program that is making more than $400,000 per year. So what you have done is to segment them out and say, we're carving you out so we can tax you more. And this is why there is such a contradiction in what this administration says and what it actually does. Let me return to a couple of questions that we discussed yesterday. Commissioner Reddick said, this is at a Finance Committee hearing last year, 53% of the IRS employees are in a full-time telework capacity. But as we discussed yesterday, this is concerning, considering that the IRS only picks up the phone about 20% of the time. And getting people back to work is going to be an imperative, getting them back to full-time work. So do you commit to exhausting funding for customer service staff before hiring new agents to go out and pick on people in the service industry?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I can't commit until I'm at the IRS and understand exactly where they are with their plans.
Okay. Let's talk about protecting data, because this is something the IRS has had kind of a checkered past when it comes to protecting consumer data. In 2015, over 700,000 Social Security numbers may have been stolen. 2017, the IRS notified Congress of over 100,000 federal student loan accounts that were accessed in a data breach. ProPublica in 2021, I think it's safe to say that there is a data security issue at the IRS. And so what I would like for you to do, if you are confirmed, is give us a plan and a timeline for implementing that plan for keeping citizens' data, taxpayer data, safe. Would you do that for us?
Yes, Senator. In fact, when I think about the data security issue and I think about the discussion that we're having on the Inflation Reduction Act today, the increased resources that the IRS is receiving under the Inflation Reduction Act, there's part of those funds that can be used to shore up data security, whether that's through technology, training, et cetera. So when the plans come together for the Inflation Reduction Act, they should reflect the very question you're asking, which is, what are the steps we're doing to be on a continuous improvement journey to improve data security?
That is helpful, and we would hope that part of that plan is more customer service agents and less field agents that are going to go audit people who do make under $400,000 a year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague, and let me just say to her, I know that this is an important issue. My understanding, and we'll be talking to the agency and both the Secretary and Mr. Werfel when confirmed, I believe he will be. This is a voluntary program. Let me emphasize that. A voluntary program, no mandates. So my understanding is if a restaurant believes that this voluntary program will make it possible for them to more easily comply with existing tax law, they would have a chance to do it. But I want my colleague to know that I'll look forward to staying in touch with her and working on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because voluntary programs end up becoming mandates, and people in the service industry are so concerned about this tip compliance.
On my watch, I assure my colleague, this is not going to be a mandatory program. We are being told the concept is voluntary if a restaurant chooses to do it, so there is no requirement whatever, and they decide that for them it would make it easier to comply with existing tax law, they could do it. So my colleague asked a question about mandates, not on my watch for these restaurants. I thank my colleague. Our next senator will be Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Werfel, congratulations for being nominated. Thank you for accepting. I thank even more your wife for allowing. Thank you for all that. I'd like to continue the conversation that Senator Blackburn initiated, but it would be a continuation of the conversation we had yesterday. And for context, I'll submit for the record a publication by ATR speaking about the problems that the IRS has had for the last 40 years to upgrade its information system. For 40 years, there are headlines such as 1.5 million tax returns delayed in processing from 1985. In 1982, grossly short of the capacity and modern state-of-the-art efficiency essential for an effective IRS system by the then director. 1986, IRS ends computer contract. The list of uglies just continues all the way up until now. My staff has looked to see that we're currently spending about, our IRS is, $200 million a year for information services, which we presume is to upgrade your systems and to monitor and to have them go. And the IRA gave the agency another $4.75 billion over 10. Frankly, this looks like good money after bad. You had mentioned yesterday the antiquated systems you have, and one of these things I have says that something that was supposed to be completed in 2014, the GAO says will not be completed till 2030. So what I'm asking now is not to revisit all that, not your fault, but it's just a mess. And we're just wasting dollars on stuff for the last 40 years we've never accomplished. What are your thoughts about doing what the Department of Defense has done, which is to move this into the cloud, to allow a cloud-based service, which, as in its work for DOD, has established that it can do things for the federal government with greater security, not the data leaks that were previously referenced, and the ability to handle highly classified material, as opposed to, again, one more time, thinking that we're going to redo something when we never do. Thoughts?
Thank you, Senator. I think that this question about information technology and how to make sure that going forward IRS investments are performing better for taxpayers is front and center in my priorities if I'm confirmed. To your question, and I just want to make a quick point, I spent a large part of my time at OMB, starting in the Bush administration, extending into the Obama administration, assessing the progress of information technology investments across government, and I learned a lot about why these projects tend to fail. One of the reasons, I think, is that we don't always have the right set of alternatives.
Let me stop, though.
Yeah.
Because what you're really talking about is the current systems we have and why they are never upgraded. It looks like DOD just said, no, we're going to a different paradigm. And because if history is prologue, these systems are not going to get fixed. We're going to be talking about a system running on Fortran and COBOL in 10 years. So I'm asking about an openness to moving it to the cloud, allowing an entity such as does for DOD to manage these systems.
And the point I was going to make, Senator, is that should absolutely be one of the alternatives that is investigated. I think there's been a theme during this discussion of, will you make decisions with evidence base? And I will, if confirmed. And I can only make a decision on IT if it's evidence-based, if I look at that type of alternative and understand, is that the best interest
So let me
of the
stop you.
taxpayer?
I only have 5 minutes. That's why I'm being rude. I apologize.
No, yes, sir.
But you were at OMB. The thing that so impressed me under a Republican and a Democratic administration, you were like up to here in looking at information systems.
Yes.
You may have even weighed in on the deliberation for DOD to move over into the cloud. So knowing that this isn't something that you'll have to learn from scratch, but rather bring a great deal of experience to, as you weigh it, knowing that you may find something different, how does it weigh now?
Yeah, I would give this serious consideration. I think we want to move systems into the 21st century. And it goes without saying that technology that's enabled in a cloud, as you point out, can be secure, it can be more efficient, it often can be more cost efficient. And so absolutely it has to be an alternative. It's premature for me to give you a firm answer. I want to do the right thing and understand the process and go through the process, understand the right analytics. But absolutely, it should be up for consideration.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for considering this job.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Our next three will be Senator Brown, Senator Tillis, and Senator Cornyn. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, thank you for your willingness to serve and willingness to do today what you're doing. My colleagues on the other side today have raised concerns about error rates with the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, two tax cuts for working families that are so important for so many. I want to get your thoughts on two bipartisan proposals to get the error rates down. Presidents of both parties, your predecessor appointed by President Trump, who I would add your predecessor did a good job beginning the child tax credit, wish that he could have kept going with it. They've asked Congress to give IRS the authority to establish minimum competency standards for paid tax preparers. I recognize you're not in this job yet, but give us your best estimate if paid tax preparers had to demonstrate a bare minimum expertise in tax preparation. Do you think we'd see fewer errors in the ITC and the CTC?
Yeah, I think that's intuitive, Senator. I absolutely think that strengthening the overall performance and skills of tax preparers would go a long way.
And I assume you're saying Congress should give IRS this authority, yes?
Well, I don't want to opine on something that's more the domain of the Office of Tax Policy. I've mentioned earlier, Senator, that I think the role of the commissioner is to answer whether it would be administratable. So I'll answer it in this way. Problems with tax preparers degrade the integrity of the tax system. So should we look for solutions to improve it? Yes.
Okay. Mr. Werfel, the volunteer income tax assistance, the VITA program, which the IRS supports, has a 94% accuracy rate. I worked with Senator Heller when he was here from Nevada some years ago to authorize the VITA grant program, recognizing this was a way to ensure accurate EITC and CTC returns. If you're confirmed, will you work with me and I hope colleagues on the committee to strengthen the VITA program?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Turning to an issue I know Senator Crapo and Senator Langford asked about, the 1099-K reporting threshold. I want the IRS to do a better job holding corporations accountable when they cheat on their taxes. What I don't think the IRS should be spending its limited resources doing is burdening Ohioans making simple transactions on third-party platforms. I was pleased the IRS delayed the new $600 1099-K threshold. That's simply too low. It ought to be higher. I think there's general agreement on this committee of that. I know you're not in the job yet. For that reason, you don't have firsthand familiarity with their operations. But does it stand to reason that if 1099-K threshold were higher, the IRS would have fewer forms to process, and for that reason would be able to focus its resources more efficiently?
Senator, if I understand your question, yes, a simpler framework would be easier to implement. That's the type of feedback that I think an IRS commissioner can provide to this committee.
Okay, and we will make those requests once you're confirmed. Last few seconds, I want to join Chairman Wyden and my other colleagues in raising our concern that black tax filers are 3 times more likely to be audited than white tax filers. I know this is of great concern to my colleague on this committee and ranking member of the Banking Committee, which Senator Tillis and I serve on. This is a great concern to Senator Scott. I know you committed to Senator Wyden to report back within 60 days of starting the job. We look forward to working with you on that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Wyden.
Thank you, Senator Brown. We'll work very closely with you on those issues.
Thanks.
All right, let's see. Next is Senator Tillis and then Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here. I appreciate it, the time that you and Ron spent in my office yesterday covering a lot of questions, and also want to welcome Beth, Molly, and Seth. I heard what Senator Blackburn said about coming and visiting Tennessee. Great state, lived there, but I know where your roots are planted. And Thank you for being willing to take on this role. I don't think there's anybody who's in this position that knows that the IRS needs to modernize, change, be more customer focused, and I gathered some of that from your discussion. You were at BCG as a managing partner and director for, was it about 8 years, 7 or 8 years?
Yeah, about 9, coming up on 9 years, yes.
And what was the nature of the practice there? Did you work on enterprise transformation? What were the, and that was in the public sector, right?
Yeah, so I worked with federal agencies, mostly with the Defense Department, but with the Commerce Department and other agencies. And the mission or the objective was, how do we bring private sector solutions successfully to government?
And how'd you do on any particular project that you could mention?
We're very successful. I mean, an example that I would provide, and I'll try to be brief, is we worked closely with the commissary system at the Defense Department. I brought experts from BCG in managing supermarkets to help there. We introduced a private label brand for the first time, and we saved hundreds of millions of dollars in how they acquire goods.
I think that it's important to know that somebody with some enterprise transformation experience, particularly in the public sector, is desperately needed at the IRS. And speaking of an enterprise transformation, I see that as what I hoped the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly in the IRS space, would have achieved. I'm curious, this would be after you're confirmed, but I don't see the distribution of money. I see less than half of it going to anything that's more customer focused. The other one half, rightfully, through a cynical eye, it looks like it's more on enforcement and audit. So it's going to be very helpful. Will you commit to me when you're confirmed that we can get a report back from the IRS on how these buckets fit into improving the customer experience versus becoming an additional burden and threat to a taxpayer?
Senator, yes, I mentioned to Senator Crapo earlier that, you know, as a former budgeteer, I think I'll be able to earn your trust with a very clearly articulated spend plan for how the money is.
I'll tell you why. My predisposition is really just looking at the buckets: taxpayer services, enforcement, operations support, business systems modernization, and a cynic could say that 2/3 of the bill has less to do with improving the customer service, the customer experience and enterprise transformation, and more to do with actually making you less liked by the taxpayers. So I'd really be interested in seeing the flexibilities in the IRA that are going to let you put money on the best and highest use, and a lot of that has to be, you're never going to be one of the top 10 most admired federal agencies because you take money from people and that's your job. But improving the experience, I think, is going to be very important. When we were doing the bipartisan infrastructure deal, I was supporting good governance policies at the IRS, improving consolidated audit trail, and enacting higher penalties for IRS agents or IRS employees who leak taxpayer information. Do you agree or disagree that we've got to work on something like a consolidated audit trail for the IRS?
Senator, I want to look at all the different levers that can be taken to improve data security. I want to sit down with the team at the IRS, with your staff and others, and look at these various levers and say, what can we strengthen? What can we change? What can we shift? All with the benefit of improving data security. So I'm certainly open to exploring these suggestions that you have.
Yeah, I think one of the, just a final comment, you don't have to respond. I intend to support your confirmation, incidentally. The $400,000 cap isn't very consoling to me, and we mentioned this in the office. On the one hand, combined income, my wife and I fall below the cap. So as an individual, I should probably feel better about it. But the small businessman that I spoke to just a couple of weeks ago that's got a business with 3 service trucks, a wife who's the CEO, the CFO, and basically mandates the schedule of the husband. That's it. That's all they got. And they've got $1 million in income that they're going to have to report. So I think it's a cop-out to say that the $400,000 limit means that the little guy shouldn't mind. You and I talked about, instead of, you know, a simplistic number cutoff, there could be a lot of people under $4,000 or $400,000 that potentially are evading taxes. But there are a lot of people, based on the activities of the business, it just doesn't look like it'd be the best and highest use of our resources to go into that small businessman's presence without any strong indicative information and subject them to an audit. So I hope as we go further into the discussion, we can figure out how we can tailor, get people who are not paying what the law requires, stipulating to Senator Johnson. Some of it shouldn't even be on the books, in my opinion, and it should be simplified. But I think that's the way I want the IRS to look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank my colleague, Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Werfel, when the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act appropriated roughly $80 billion for the IRS through 2031, were you aware of any plan that was in place that instructed that appropriation, or was this money appropriated to the IRS in this multi-year fashion without any concrete plan in place on how it would be spent?
I'm not aware of a plan that's been published. I am aware that Secretary Yellen has asked my potential predecessor if I'm confirmed for such a plan that you described.
Yeah, well, that bothers me a lot. This is sort of typical of Washington, D.C. We appropriate the money and ask for the plan later, rather than ask for the plan and say, how much money do you need to actually implement the plan? I too am a little troubled by some of the political rhetoric around the IRS, given particularly the checkered history of the IRS and targeting certain taxpayers that you're all too familiar with as a result of your coming in after the Lois Lerner affair and the targeting of certain taxpayers. But the president said we're not going to collect taxes from people making under $400,000 a year. Actually, he didn't say that exactly. He said we're not going to have increased audits of people making less than $400,000 a year. Will you commit to collecting all lawful taxes that taxpayers owe, regardless of whether they are the top 1% or whether they earn less than $400,000 a year?
Yes, Senator, and I think it's an important clarification that the directive from Secretary Yellen was to make sure that Inflation Reduction Act funds do not increase audit rates for those earning less than $400,000, but all those individuals still have a responsibility and a balance due. But as described earlier in this hearing, I think a vast majority of them are honest taxpayers who are ready and willing to do their civic duty and meet their obligation. And for them, my focus should be, I think, on improving service.
Well, let me ask you about the Treasury Inspector General on Tax Administration's report for fiscal year 2021, because I think the record of the IRS with regard to implementing some of the tax credit provisions that I assume have come up here before today leave a lot to be concerned about. For example, 28% of total earned income tax credits were improperly made, 28%. 13% of additional child tax credits were improperly paid, and 26% of American Opportunity tax credits were improperly paid. This has been a long-standing issue for the IRS. Please tell me that you're going to look into that and try to make sure that people who are receiving money from the federal government, other taxpayers in effect, through improper payments, tell me that you're going to look into that and try to reduce those numbers dramatically.
Senator, absolutely. I mean, I've talked about my background a lot today. For a while in government, actually for many years, I was known around town as the improper payments guy. That was my job for both President Bush and President Obama. I've thought a lot about this issue, and certainly will focus on it when I'm there if I get confirmed.
Well, I'm a little concerned that when I hear one of my colleagues suggest this is a problem with unlicensed tax preparers only. It strikes me that no matter who is preparing the tax return, that it's the responsibility of the U.S. government and the IRS in particular to make sure that improper payments are not being made. Would you agree that both of those are important?
Yes, both. I mean, look, we should it's all about building trust and improving program integrity, and we should be addressing improper payments for sure.
Well, ultimately, I think there are three simple questions that we need to ask about whether the IRS is meeting its stated mission. One, did taxpayers find filing their tax return easier in the current year than they did in the previous year? Secondly, were taxpayers' questions and problems handled as smoothly as account inquiries for their bank, credit card company, or utility? And third, did IRS personnel treat taxpayers respectfully and professionally? Obviously, we know the IRS has had a long history of struggling to meet those goals, but I hope it's your commitment to us here today that that would be your intention.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I think Senator Whitehouse is next.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Good to be with you. Best wishes to you in your pursuit for one of the more challenging and least popular jobs in town. Couple of things. First, some of us here, particularly Senator Crapo, but many of us have worked together on trying to make the United States a less attractive haven for foreign criminals and kleptocrats to hide their ill-gotten gains. One of the means for doing that is something called reciprocal FATCA, so that we trade information with other countries. Are you familiar with that?
I am, Senator.
Are you generally in favor of that?
Yes, FATCA was on the books during my brief stint at the IRS in 2013. I gained an understanding of the importance of working internationally to eliminate safe havens. I think, you know, the idea of a Swiss bank account is more and more in the rearview mirror because of FATCA, and I think, but obviously there's more work to be done.
The code of trust is more impenetrable. So, if you don't mind, when, as and if you're confirmed, I'm going to ask for your advice, because we are drafting a reciprocal FATCA statute. We want to make sure we can get the details right with you. You okay with that?
Yes.
Second, the plan for IRS reform, I'd love you to share it with us as soon as you can, so we have an idea whether you're complying with what I think our three goals were, which are better customer service, more rapid refunds, and real diligence in going after the returns of complex high-income filers who appear to have been getting away with a lot of mischief at the high end of the income spectrum. So if those are your three goals, I'm for it, and I hope your plan will bear that out.
Yes, Senator, I'm aligned with those goals and values.
And last is the problem of 501Cs, particularly 501c4s, but the problem is spreading a little bit. The first thing is that we have seen political money flow through 501c4s in explosive, unexpected numbers. Nobody ever thought it was going to be like this years ago, but here we are, literally billions of dollars pouring through, hiding who's spending the billions. And I'm interested in finding out what the IRS is doing just to track those numbers, how much is flowing through. So that's problem one, scale. Problem two is, what happens when 501c4s glom together into a pod and the donation goes into one, 50% on politics, the other 50% to another, 50% on politics, now it's 75, 50%, the remainder to another, 50% on politics, now you're up to 87. And if you've got 4 or 5 of these things that are just donation cycling like that, you can blow through the nominal IRS 50% limit with very little schemery, and we should try to penetrate that schemery and figure out if that's happening. It seems to me that that was not the intention of the 50% rule, that you could pod together a bunch of 501c4s and end up having essentially all the money go into politics in a coordinated effort. So that's the second thing. And the third is the standard political operation right now is a 501c3 and a 501c4 that are essentially twins. They have the same staff, they have the same location, they have the same donors, they probably have the same email systems and everything else.
that boundary between a 501c3 and a 501c4 is something that I think is worth protecting because there are differences between the two. And I don't believe the IRS has ever looked at whether the corporate veil between a 501c3 and a 501c4 is real, or whether you could penetrate that corporate veil with a banana, for Pete's sake. So those are things that I'm going to ask you to look at, and I hope that you'll keep an open mind with respect to that. There's enormous pressure and noise on this issue, but I think doing the right thing will see you through. Any comment?
I appreciate your leadership on this issue. You know, and have articulated it. It's a complicated area. But yes, I am open to working with you and the others on this committee to see where the IRS is today and where it needs to go going forward. Absolutely.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thank my colleague. I've got several additional questions, Mr. Werfel. I want to let my colleague, because we try to always have parity here, we'll ask a couple of questions, but if any colleague who hasn't had a chance to ask questions, whether they be a Democrat or a Republican, will break from what we're talking about for them, okay?
Understood.
My first question deals with the backlog of 2.6 million original returns awaiting processing. These are essentially these individual paper returns that you're constituting, the backlog. Now, I think it's important that progress has been made, but that's still a very substantial backlog of original returns that await processing. And one of the things that troubles me greatly is that the IRS is still transcribing so many returns manually instead of following common sense recommendations to scan them like most of the states. And Secretary Yellen has said that the IRS would scan millions, including this filing season, but as far as I can tell, maybe you can give us an update, the IRS is still testing this technology. So what's going to be done to ensure that the IRS really has a serious program with respect to scanning like basically almost everybody else is?
Senator, thank you for the question. I think one of the things that motivates me about wanting to be the IRS commissioner is a picture that I think was in the Washington Post months ago. I think it was a cafeteria in Austin with a table full of paper returns. And I thought to myself when I saw that picture, there are technologies emerging that can potentially rapidly scan them and do so in a way that creates them into machine-readable content that would allow that backlog to be reduced quicker. Since I'm not there, Senator, or Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure where the IRS is on that, but I think it's a huge priority to enhance scanning so that we can move out of paper.
I just hope that you all will move more quickly on this, because I've been hearing the scanning is coming, and it always sounds like the marquee at the old movie house where people say, oh, it's coming soon, the picture is coming soon, but it doesn't get there, and I think we gotta get going. So we're gonna let Senator Carper and Senator Young ask the next questions, and at that point, depending on whether additional colleagues will come, then it would be Senator Johnson's turn since I asked an additional question. Senator Carper.
Yeah. Senator Wyden, thanks so much for this opportunity. Senator Johnson, nice to be with you. Congratulations, Ron, on being named our ranking member. So, I want to talk, how's it going so far?
I think it's going well, Senator.
Good, thank you. I look to his family behind him and give a thumbs up. What do you guys think, huh? All right. You look mighty proud, you should. One of my proudest responsibilities as a U.S. Senator serving the people of Delaware is supporting my constituents. We've got exactly 1 million people live in Delaware now who come to Chris Coons and Lisa Rochester and myself with various federal agencies. They want to help with various federal agencies. But one of the agencies that leads the hit parade in terms of we need to provide more help, better help, is the IRS. And I receive regular reports from my constituent services team in our state, and the IRS frequently ranks at or near the top of the list of issues that we're hearing the most about from Delawareans, and it's not always complimentary. I was very heartened to see that since the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted last fall, the IRS has already begun putting the funds that Congress provided to good use. Some of my colleagues have already mentioned this, but I think it bears repeating. Since hiring 5,000 workers to staff the phones using Inflation Reduction Act funding, the IRS is now answering 90% of taxpayer phone calls this 2023 tax season. That's up from, get this, 13% of the calls answered during last year's tax season. So from a lowly 13% to 90% as a result of the ability to hire that additional 5,000 workers says volumes. What additional measure, and let me just say, when I was privileged to be governor of Delaware, we had there was something called J.D. Powers Quality Awards, and that would go to a company in our state or a nonprofit in our state. Last year I was governor, it went to the Division of Revenue, which is like the state version of the IRS. They won the Quality Award for service that they provided to the people of Delaware, and I want to see some of the IRS get that kind of recognition for quality. But what additional measures would you take as commissioner to ensure that the IRS is responsive to taxpayers who need assistance? And how will you improve transparency and communications between the IRS and taxpayers across the board?
Senator, thank you for the question. And,
you bet.
And I too am learning of this information of improvements, significant improvements, it sounds like, in terms of call rates answered. But beyond that, I think we also want to put people in taxpayer assistance centers. I've also heard reports that taxpayer assistance centers aren't staffed the way they need to be, so there's long lines there or people can't get in. I think there's an opportunity beyond just putting people in the call centers, which is critical, digital solutions, enhancing the functionality of applications on iPhones, of the website, so that people find their experience in an electronic format to be extraordinarily helpful. One of the things, Senator, that I think could be very important to do is to benchmark what are other world-class customer service organizations doing that the IRS is not? How are they measuring their customer experience in a way that the IRS is not? My objective would be, because of how important I think it is to Americans, that we should not only be benchmarking what these organizations are doing, we should be able to beat them. We should be better. And that would be my objective.
Good. That reminds me of find out what works, do more of that. Yeah. There you go. Find out what doesn't work, do less of that. How have your experiences in both the public and private sectors prepared you for this role to lead the IRS workforce? How would you as commissioner work to fill the gaps in the workforce, improve training practices, and otherwise uplift the agency's almost 80,000 full-time employees to ensure that they can perform to the best of their ability for American taxpayers?
Yeah, well, I go back to I think about my bio and the fact that I joined as a GS-9 and, early in my career really developed an understanding of what the perspective is of the civil servants, developed expertise and subject matter on really the nuts and bolts of government. I'm kind of a government geek, Senator Carper. I tell people, like, if you want to get a cup of coffee and talk about the latest changes to OMB Circular A11, I'm your guy. I think I bring that foundation, but on top of that, I've had and been blessed to have these experiences of leading in both crisis, whether it was, the work I did with the CFO Council after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to organize our approach in how federal funds would flow to deal with that crisis, to helping implement the Recovery Act in 2009. All of these, and then obviously my time at the IRS in 2013. And then 9 years in the private sector, where I really kind of got my eyes opened in terms of what are some of the innovative and cutting edge solutions that are out there that I really think the government could benefit from. So all these layers, Senator, if I can effectively bring those layers to the IRS, empower and position the workforce to be successful, I think we can achieve a lot of these objectives and answer a lot of the questions that have been presented today.
Yeah, thanks for that response. Thanks for, again, your willingness to do this. Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask a unanimous consent request to ask a question with respect to the free file program.
I was going to ask about that, and I'm glad you are.
Good. There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right. Let's. We're going to have to backtrack a little bit. We've got Senator Thune, and then it would be Senator Young and Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know this ground's been covered a little bit already with Senator Grassley, but I am very interested in the IRS's plan, annual plan, on how they're going to deploy the $80 billion in mandatory funding that you all have received. He and I have a bill we've introduced, the IRS Funding Accountability Act, among other things. It would require the IRS to submit to Congress a detailed spending plan annually, and it seems to me at least that keeping Congress informed of IRS progress and any changes in that plan makes sense regardless of the status of our bill. I know you've been asked this, but I would like to just press on it a little bit if I might, and that is, if confirmed, will you direct the IRS to update its spending plan annually for Congress to review? $80 billion is 6 times your annual budget. We're talking about 87,000 new employees. So would you commit to, will you direct the IRS to update its spending plan annually?
Senator, I would say it's so important that the plan we have is transparent, is updated, is clear to you and the American people. Just sitting here, I think an annual update is reasonable. I do want to talk with the IRS employees and the Treasury Department once I become a federal employee, if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed, to confirm my understanding. But the general principle of updated plans annually resonates with me.
So thank you, and I hope that you will be able to make a more definitive commitment after consultation. So in this new funding, $46 billion of it goes toward enforcement, and only 4% toward helping with the filing claims of ordinary tax filers. And to me, it seems like the record, at least the current record, recent record of the IRS, which includes 10 million unprocessed tax returns and a 13% phone call pickup rate in 2022, that improving taxpayer services ought to be the #1 priority. Now, obviously, the allocation of funding doesn't suggest that. When you have 46% allocated to enforcement and audits and going after people, only 4% or $3.2 billion for taxpayer service. So again, in terms of priorities, as you look at this issue, what will be the higher priority for you when it comes to administering the IRS funding allocation? Better customer service to taxpayers or increasing the number of audits on Americans?
It'll be a dual priority, Senator, equally focused on improving taxpayer service, in particular for working families and small businesses. And side by side with that will be a commitment to improve the IRS's capacity to unpack complex returns, which is something I understand today they lack that capacity.
Well, I hope that you will, that the agency will double down when it comes to just dealing with prioritizing taxpayer services. I mean, that data, those numbers are just non-defensible, inexcusable, and needs to be fixed. Let me just ask, and maybe this has been asked already as well, but the data breach going back to 2021, the ProPublica data breach, there still hasn't been any, accountability on the leak or the breach of private taxpayer information. And I know you're going to punt that to the Justice Department, but do you think it's acceptable that here we are 2 years later and there still isn't any information about what happened there, who the leaker was? And I'm just, if confirmed, would you take steps to ensure that that kind of confidential taxpayer information, one, that the breach is, there's accountability there, and two, that it doesn't happen again?
Senators, I think about the nuts and bolts of tax administration. Data security is a top priority. I don't know how to build trust with the public when there's a sense that there's risk, material risk of unauthorized disclosures. What gives me some degree of comfort, you mentioned the Justice Department, but what gives me some degree of comfort is the Taxpayer Inspector General is extraordinarily important role whenever there's a potential breach to understand the root cause. So one of the things that I will absolutely do is work with the Inspector General to understand what do they see as the risks, and any specific action or activity that's taken place, Have they investigated? What are the root causes? Are there corrective actions? Because if there are, we will make them.
Okay, and I just, again, would reiterate that it would help enormously if there would be accountability for those that have already happened. We don't have that yet for the one that happened in 2021. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good. Senator Young, you're up next, and followed by Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Werfel. Good to have you before the committee, and congratulations on your nomination. I've been overseeing the IRS for a number of years, and it's really unfortunate between targeting of particular taxpayers for their political beliefs and the backlog and returns. There's been a significant downward trend in terms of public trust for the IRS institutionally, and I think also in terms of service delivery. I've been seeing all kinds of problems. So I'm hoping you're the guy who can help turn all of this around. The IRS is receiving a substantial amount of money, $80 billion, and that's on top of their $12 billion a year typical budget. So we need to make sure that is used effectively and efficiently. So as it relates to funding, the IRS has had serious transparency issues over the years, and the garbage in, garbage out principle has applied to their dashboard of statistics at times. Some recent headlines trumpeting the vast improvements of the IRS's phone service based upon the IRS's so-called level of service statistic. National Taxpayer Advocate has indicated that this level of service statistic really cooks the books. It's not an accurate reflection of the genuine level of service. It omits the fact that the IRS call volumes are actually down significantly to date as compared to last year, nearly 41% overall. And, you know, all else being equal, if you have a lower number of phone calls, that will increase the level of service statistic. But what we've actually seen is the IRS has actually answered 200,000 fewer calls to date this year as compared to last year. So I'm hopeful that you can take a look at that statistic in isolation, but also attend to the other metrics to review performance. Mr. Werfel, I know measuring performance is important to you because we have discussed this. Do you agree that the IRS or any other federal agency should not be relying on this sort of flawed data to make decisions?
Senator, yeah, I think about I don't know that this data is flawed. I do know that it's really important that decisions that are made in tax administration or any government agency, that it's analytically robust, that there's an evidence base that guides it, that there's integrity in the information that's being reported publicly or being used behind closed doors to drive decision making. So if there are questions about the integrity of a particular metric, right, I will roll up sleeves and get to the bottom of it.
Great. Just making sure that you're embracing what I would regard as the right principle of administration. You don't have to speak to any particular statistic, but do you commit to me here that you will make sure that the IRS is only providing, disseminating, using unbiased and informative data? Yes or no?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to be unbiased in what we do.
Okay, thank you. TIGTA, you mentioned how important this Inspector General is to provision of services. They recently reported that in FY 2016, the IRS's digital interactions with taxpayers on average cost only 20 cents per interaction, whereas other types of interactions cost the IRS hundreds of times more. $42 per interaction through phones, $57 per interaction through correspondence, and $68 per interaction at a taxpayer assistance center. I think that's somewhat intuitive, right? Not all interactions the IRS has with taxpayers can or even should be digitally based. They certainly acknowledge that, but there's a massive backlog of processing that needs to occur of returns. And that to me is sort of showcased in very stark terms that the current systems aren't sufficient to process those returns. Of additional concern, that this labor-intensive process that I think is disproportionately relied upon is 285 times more expensive than a digital one, according to TIGTA. So this is a double loss where taxpayers are paying a lot more for services that aren't meeting their needs. I'm going to ask you, because my time's coming to an end, if confirmed, will you commit to promptly providing me an answer, which I don't expect you to have right now, to the following question? Assuming the IRS had a working, fully digital platform for taxpayer inquiries and correspondence, how much less would the IRS have spent in FY20, FY21, or FY22 to perform that function?
I will work with the team to figure out what the best potential way to answer that question and come up with the most robust estimate.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
All done? All done? All right, thanks. Next, Catherine Cortez Masto, and she'll be followed by, I think, by Senator Warren. I believe you're next. Yes, thank you. Saving the best to last. Here we